Imagine this. You're at a celebration surrounded by the laughter of friends, the sound of fireworks cracking in the night sky, and the feeling that the world is full of possibility. You meet someone, a stranger perhaps, but they seem harmless. Maybe they even share a smile, a drink, a laugh with you. And then, just months later, you find out that the person you spoke to, the person who seemed so ordinary, is hiding something unimaginable. They've been living a double life, one that no one could ever have predicted. This is the chilling story of Lydia Tillman, a woman whose life changed in an instant. A woman who met a killer without ever knowing it, who became the target of a brutal attack, and whose survival defies belief. But this story doesn't end with Lydia's escape. It weaves through a dark and twisted tale of murder, lies, and an unimaginable horror that few could have fathomed. The man who assaulted Lydia, who nearly left her for dead, was Travis Forbes. At the time, he was nothing more than a stranger to her, a man she briefly crossed paths with on a summer evening in Fort Collins, Colorado. What Lydia didn't know, what no one could have possibly guessed, was that only months earlier Forbes had brutally murdered a young woman, a 19-year-old named Kenia Monge. Kenia's body would be found hidden in a freezer, a grim secret locked away in Forbes' apartment. But it gets darker still, because Lydia wasn't his first victim, and she would barely escape with her life. How did Lydia Tillman survive such a brutal attack? And what led Travis Forbes down this horrific path? Tonight, we will follow the twists and turns of a case that shocks the conscience. From fireworks and festivities to a struggle for survival, we'll trace every chilling moment, every hidden truth that led to a life-or-death fight for one woman's survival. Lydia had no idea. She had no idea that, when she walked into that apartment, she was walking into the hands of a man whose past was drenched in blood, a man capable of unspeakable acts. This is the story of how one woman survived what most never could, and how a killer's mask finally slipped, exposing the dark, horrifying truth about what he had done. But this is more than just the story of one woman's terrifying ordeal. It's a story of justice, of mystery, and of an investigation that would unravel the chilling secrets hidden by Travis Forbes. Stay with us as we piece together the shocking events of that fateful night. What happened inside that apartment? What led to Lydia's escape? And how did the police, just days later, discover the grisly truth of Kenia Monge's fate? But first, let's rewind, back to that fateful night. To July 4, 2011. A night when the sky above Fort Collins, Colorado, was filled with fireworks and celebration. Little did anyone know, in the midst of the festivities, a violent predator was waiting. Lydia Tillman was a 30-year-old woman out for a night of celebration. Like so many others, she was caught up in the joy of the moment, the spark of summer, the carefree feeling that comes with a night of fireworks and laughter. But unbeknownst to Lydia, she was walking right into the hands of a man who had already taken a life. She had no idea that Travis Forbes, a man who seemed like any other person, was about to change her life in the most horrific way imaginable. Forbes had a secret, one that would be revealed later, and a dark history that had already claimed the life of 19-year-old Kenia Monge. Just months before, Kenia had gone missing, vanishing without a trace. Her family had searched desperately for answers, but little did they know that Forbes was already living among them, hiding his deadly secret in plain sight. And now he had set his sights on Lydia. She had no way of knowing that the man who had struck up a conversation with her, who had invited her back to his apartment, was capable of unspeakable violence. But how did this all unfold? How did a seemingly innocent evening turn into a nightmare? Lydia stepped into the apartment, unaware of the horror that awaited her. She had no idea that this would be the place where she would face a brutal, life-threatening attack. In the quiet of that apartment, Forbes would unleash a violent assault, beating her, strangling her, and leaving her for dead. But Lydia wouldn't give up. She would fight. She would survive. But how? How did she manage to escape, and what would be the cost of that escape? As we follow her journey, we'll uncover the chilling truth behind her terrifying ordeal and the investigation that would eventually reveal the killer's identity. Lydia didn't give up. She didn't stay down. Somehow, despite the overwhelming pain, despite the fear, she found the strength to leave that apartment. But it wasn't over yet. What would come next? Would she be believed? Would the truth about Travis Forbes and his past be uncovered before it was too late? Stay with us as we follow the investigation that led to one of the most shocking revelations, a discovery that would not only expose the killer's past but also unlock the twisted web of lies he had spun. This case was just beginning, and the answers were far darker than anyone could have imagined. Lydia Tillman was a woman who, on the surface, lived an ordinary life. She was 30 years old, born and raised in Colorado, with a sharp mind and a gentle heart. Lydia had always been the kind of person who embraced the joys of life, a friend to many and a stranger to few. She worked in marketing, often traveling for work, but when she was at home she found solace in the simple things: long walks through the mountains, Sunday brunches with friends, and nights out in downtown Fort Collins, where the energy of the city could make anyone feel alive. Her friends would describe her as warm, fun, and full of life, someone who was always ready with a joke or a kind word. She didn't have any major worries. She didn't have any reason to expect that her life could suddenly change in the most brutal and terrifying way possible. It was July 4, 2011, an evening of celebration, fireworks, and the gathering of families and friends. Fort Collins was alive with excitement, the air filled with the smell of popcorn and the sound of distant fireworks. People crowded the streets, celebrating the holiday with their loved ones, all enjoying a perfect summer night. For Lydia, the evening seemed just like any other. She was meeting a few friends at a local bar before heading to the fireworks show. The atmosphere was lighthearted. There was laughter, music, and the sense that anything could happen on a night like this. But little did Lydia know, this was the night she would come face to face with a man who would change her life forever. It was at the bar where she met Travis Forbes. He was a 30-year-old man with a friendly demeanor, a man who blended into the crowd easily. He wasn't strikingly handsome, but there was something about him that was disarming. His easy smile, the way he made conversation, the way he seemed to listen attentively. He and Lydia spoke casually at first, exchanging pleasantries about the fireworks show. Forbes seemed like a man with a good sense of humor, someone who could easily make her laugh. But there was something about him that Lydia couldn't quite place, a subtle oddness, a coldness beneath his surface that would only reveal itself later. Forbes invited Lydia to join him at his apartment after the fireworks, claiming he had a perfect view of the display from his window. Lydia, feeling the light buzz of the evening, agreed. She had no reason to think twice. He was charming and the night was still young. What she didn't know was that, just a few months before, Forbes had committed an unspeakable crime, one that would have horrific consequences for Lydia and the people who cared about her. But at that moment, all Lydia knew was that she was heading into a stranger's apartment, where the evening would take a turn no one could have ever predicted. Travis Forbes was no stranger to darkness, but you would never know it by looking at him. By all outward appearances, he was just another guy in his early 30s, living a quiet life in Fort Collins, Colorado. He worked a regular job as a laborer and was known around town as a friendly, unassuming person. No one would have guessed that behind his unremarkable exterior lay the heart of a killer. Forbes had always been a man who kept to himself. He had never married, nor had many close friends. His relationships were fleeting, shallow at best, but he maintained a low profile, fitting in just enough to be seen as an ordinary man. It was a life of quiet anonymity, one where no one really looked too closely, and it worked for him. But beneath the surface, something was lurking, something twisted and dark that had already claimed the life of 19-year-old Kenia Monge. Kenia had disappeared on March 1, 2011, after a night out with friends in Denver. Her body was found weeks later, stored in a freezer in the very apartment where Forbes would later meet Lydia. Forbes had already begun his descent into violence long before Lydia's fateful encounter. Kenia's murder was gruesome. She had been strangled, her body concealed with chilling finality. But Forbes was smart. He knew how to avoid suspicion, how to blend into the background and maintain an air of normalcy. To most people he seemed like an ordinary man. What they didn't know was that he had already crossed a line from which there was no return. Kenia Monge was just the beginning. Lydia Tillman would soon become another tragic chapter in the story of a man who seemed like any other, a man who had already buried his darkest secret. As Forbes and Lydia made their way to his apartment that evening, there was no sign, no clue, that this was the same man who had taken another life months before. For all Lydia knew, Forbes was just another stranger she met at a bar. But she had no idea what awaited her inside. When Lydia entered Travis Forbes' apartment, she had no reason to fear. There were no flashing warning signs, no immediate red flags. Forbes had offered a casual invitation. His apartment had a great view of the fireworks. It all seemed harmless, maybe even charming. But that's the way predators work, gaining trust, blending in, and waiting for the perfect moment. Inside, the apartment seemed ordinary, but there was something unsettling about the silence. The air felt still, as though the room was waiting for something. Forbes offered Lydia a drink and they made small talk, the night feeling as light and carefree as any other. But then, without warning, the atmosphere shifted. Forbes turned on Lydia with a violent ferocity that caught her completely off guard. He didn't hesitate. He attacked her swiftly and without mercy. First came the beating. Lydia had no chance to defend herself. He hit her in the face with such force that it shattered her jaw. The pain was blinding, and the world spun around her as she struggled to stay conscious. Then he strangled her, his hands wrapping around her neck with a brutal force. Her breath came in gasps, and for a moment, it felt like the world was closing in. She thought she was going to die. But it wasn't over yet. Forbes wasn't finished. He had one final act of violence to complete before he would leave her for dead. He doused her with bleach, an act of cruelty that seemed to make the already horrifying attack even more vile. The bleach burned her skin, and as she gasped for breath, she wondered if she would ever escape. Forbes left her there, a broken, bloody mess. Lydia's body lay motionless on the floor. The apartment was silent again, as though the violence had never occurred. The only sounds were the distant echoes of fireworks outside, a cruel reminder of the life that had been shattered within these four walls. But Lydia didn't give up. In the midst of the pain, in the midst of the horror, she found a spark of life within her. Somehow, against all odds, she would survive. But who would believe her? How could she convince anyone of what had just happened? Travis Forbes was a man who seemed so ordinary. How could anyone ever see him for what he truly was? Lydia was left for dead, but somehow, against all odds, she survived. Her body battered, bruised, and broken, but still she fought. She made it out of that apartment alive. But the real question was, who would believe her story? Could she convince the world of the evil she had encountered in that apartment? And what would happen when the truth about Travis Forbes began to surface? Stay with us as we unravel the story of how a woman's fight for survival led to the exposure of a twisted and chilling double life. What happened to Lydia was only the beginning of a much darker journey. The nightmare was far from over. Against all odds, Lydia Tillman somehow survived. Her body, battered and broken, told the story of a brutal attack, but her spirit, her determination, was even stronger. In the moments after Forbes left her for dead, Lydia lay motionless on the floor of his apartment. Her jaw shattered, blood pooling around her, and bleach burning into her skin. It seemed impossible that she could still be alive. But she was. With incredible willpower, Lydia fought through the overwhelming pain. Every movement was agony. Her limbs felt heavy and uncooperative, and her head spun in dizzying circles. But she knew she had to escape. If she didn't, she would die. Somehow, she managed to pull herself to her feet. Her steps were unsteady, and the world around her felt like a haze. Her clothes were soaked in blood, her face swollen beyond recognition. Still, she stumbled through the apartment, struggling to keep her balance as the sharp pain in her jaw and neck nearly overwhelmed her. With a final, desperate push, she made it out of the apartment. Her vision blurred and she could barely walk, but she kept going. She made her way down the darkened streets of Fort Collins, fighting against the night, fighting against the terror that seemed to loom around every corner. The blood was still pouring from her injuries, and she was on the verge of losing consciousness, but Lydia refused to give up. She had to get help. As she staggered through the streets, her mind was a whirl of confusion. She was in shock, but the only thought that kept her going was the knowledge that she had to make it to safety. She couldn't let Forbes get away with what he had done. He had taken Kenia's life and tried to take hers as well. And Lydia wouldn't let him. She finally made it to a nearby business and collapsed in front of the door, barely able to get her words out. The owner of the business called 911, and the police arrived shortly after. Lydia was rushed to the hospital, where doctors immediately began treating her injuries. She had been sexually assaulted, strangled, beaten beyond recognition, and burned with bleach, but she was alive. And that was all that mattered. Lydia's bravery in the face of such unspeakable pain was nothing short of heroic. She had survived the unthinkable, but what came next was going to be just as terrifying. The first hours after Lydia's escape were filled with confusion, uncertainty, and disbelief. When the police arrived at the scene, they found a woman in critical condition, barely able to speak, yet clutching a terrifying tale. As Lydia was rushed to the hospital, detectives were left with little to go on except the statement she was able to give them. The initial report painted a brutal picture of the attack. A woman attacked and left for dead by a man she had just met. The apartment was a crime scene, bloodstains, shattered furniture, and broken pieces of a violent struggle. The brutality of the assault was clear, but there were still many unanswered questions. Who was this man? What had triggered such violence? Detectives immediately began to piece together Lydia's account. She described her attacker as a man named Travis Forbes, someone she had met only hours before at the 4th of July celebration. She told them about the firework-filled night, the walk to Forbes' apartment, and the attack that had followed. But her story didn't immediately connect to any prior crimes. It was clear that Forbes had been hiding his true nature. But there was something about the case that seemed familiar. Something about the violence that felt unnervingly calculated. It wasn't until they dug deeper into Forbes' background that the chilling truth began to emerge. As investigators continued to search for answers, something strange began to surface. They learned that Travis Forbes had a history, one that they couldn't ignore. For months, he had been living under the radar, blending into the community, hiding a dark secret. He was no stranger to crime, and it wasn't long before they discovered his connection to the disappearance of 19-year-old Kenia Monge. Kenia had been reported missing on March 1, 2011, after a night out in Denver. Her disappearance had shocked her family and friends, and the police launched an extensive search effort. Flyers were posted, search teams combed the area, and volunteers joined the search. But despite their best efforts, there was no trace of Kenia. The case remained unsolved. But what the police didn't know was that Kenia's body was already in a freezer. And the man responsible for her murder was Travis Forbes. Forbes had lured Kenia into his apartment, much like he had done with Lydia, and he had done to her what he had tried to do to Lydia. He assaulted her, strangled her, and killed her. But unlike Lydia, Kenia didn't survive. Forbes had kept her body hidden in his freezer for weeks, while her family and friends held on to hope that she would be found. It wasn't until Lydia's attack that the connection between Forbes and Kenia's case was made. When investigators searched Forbes' apartment, they found the freezer, along with the chilling remains of Kenia Monge. DNA evidence would soon confirm it. The body in the freezer was Kenia's. But the question remained, how had Forbes gotten away with it for so long? And what had led him to attack Lydia in such a similar manner? As the investigation into Travis Forbes deepened, a breakthrough finally came in the form of DNA evidence. After the discovery of Kenia's body in the freezer, forensic scientists matched the DNA found at the crime scene to the evidence gathered from Lydia's attack. The similarities were undeniable. But the case didn't end there. Witnesses began to come forward, confirming that they had seen Forbes with Kenia on the night she disappeared. They described him as calm, seemingly ordinary, just like he had appeared to Lydia on that fateful night. But in reality, Forbes was anything but ordinary. He was a predator who had already claimed one life, and he had almost taken another. With the evidence mounting, the police were able to arrest Travis Forbes. He was charged with the murder of Kenia Monge, the attempted murder of Lydia Tillman, and a series of other crimes linked to his twisted past. But as the police closed in on him, there was still one lingering question. Why? What was Forbes' motive? What had driven him to commit such horrific acts? As the investigation into Forbes deepened, the police began to uncover even more chilling details about his past. They dug into his history, his relationships, and his behavior, hoping to find some sort of explanation for his horrific actions. But the more they uncovered, the darker the picture became. Forbes had always been a loner with a history of violence that stretched back years. He had been arrested multiple times for assault, but each time he had slipped through the cracks. His relationships were fleeting, and he had no real ties to anyone or anything. He had lived a life of isolation, quietly stalking his victims before striking when they least expected it. But what was perhaps the most disturbing part of the investigation was the lack of remorse. In his questioning, Forbes remained eerily calm, stone-faced. He didn't seem to care about what he had done. To him, it was just another act, another kill, another attack. The police were left wondering, was this man simply a monster, or was there something deeper at play? What had driven him to such extreme violence, and why had he chosen Lydia as his next target? As the investigation continued, the truth began to slowly emerge, but the mystery behind Forbes' motivations, and the sheer brutality of his actions, would leave investigators and the public questioning what kind of man he truly was. As the interrogation of Travis Forbes continued, the answers remained just out of reach. He sat across from detectives, his expression unreadable, his demeanor cold and unflinching. The detectives pressed him for answers, but Forbes said little, his stone-faced silence only adding to the growing sense of unease. He was a man who had killed, who had tortured, and who had seemingly no conscience. But the more they dug, the more the questions seemed to multiply. What was Forbes' true motive? Why did he attack Lydia after already taking Kenia's life? What had driven him to target women in such a brutal and calculated way? For the detectives, the answers were frustratingly elusive. And with each passing day, the mystery deepened. But one thing was clear. Travis Forbes was not the ordinary man he appeared to be. And the full extent of his crimes was yet to be revealed. Stay with us as we explore the darkest depths of Travis Forbes' mind and uncover the twisted truth behind his crimes. What drove him to kill? And will the justice system truly serve those he harmed, or will he slip through the cracks once again?